I have often observed that the English countryside possesses an almost supernatural ability to conceal the most extraordinary crimes beneath its veneer of pastoral tranquility. Never was this more apparent than in the affair I'm about to relate, a case which my friend Hercule Poirot would later describe as a symphony of human greed played in the key of deception. The matter began, as these things often do, with a telegram that arrived at our London flat on a grey November morning in 1934. Poirot was seated at breakfast, his 3 boiled eggs arranged with mathematical precision, his moustaches waxed to their customary perfection, when Mrs. Pearson, our long-suffering landlady, knocked upon our door. "A telegram for Monsieur Poirot," she announced, holding the yellow envelope as though it might explode. "Marked urgent it is." Poirot accepted the telegram with his characteristic deliberation, examining the envelope before opening it with a silver letter knife. His green eyes, sharp as a cat's, scanned the contents twice before he passed it to me without comment. I read, "Monsieur Hercule Poirot, London. Urgent assistance required. Stop Duchess of Ravenshade, found dead stop. No will discovered, stop family circumstances. Suspicious, stop please come at once. Stop Sir Reginald Ashworth, Witchford Abbey, Surrey." "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. "The Duchess of Witchford. That's the old lady who's been in all the society pages, isn't it? Her charities, her famous garden parties?" Poirot nodded slowly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Duchess Beatrice of Witchford, oui. 78 years of age, worth approximately £500,000, and possessed of what the newspapers call an iron will. She has been, how do you say, the matriarch of one of England's most prominent families. And now she's dead with no will found," I mused. "Rather careless for someone of her standing, wouldn't you say?" "Précisément, mon ami. That is what makes this telegram so very interesting." Poirot's eyes gleamed with that peculiar light I had learned to associate with a particularly intriguing puzzle. Wealthy women of advanced years do not simply forget to make wills. They are, as a rule, most meticulous about such matters, and when Sir Reginald Ashworth, a man of impeccable reputation and considerable discretion, uses the word suspicious, one must pay attention. You know Sir Reginald. By reputation only. He is the family solicitor, a gentleman of the old school. He would not summon Hercule Poirot lightly. Poirot rose from his chair with decision. "Come, Hastings. We shall pack for the countryside. I suspect we are about to encounter a most instructive example of human nature at its most creative. The gathering of suspects." The journey to Surrey was accomplished in relative silence, Poirot alternating between periods of intense concentration and the perusal of a French novel. It was late afternoon when our hired motorcar turned through the imposing gates of Witchford Abbey, proceeding up a tree-lined drive toward one of the most magnificent country houses I had ever seen. Witchford Abbey was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, its honey-colored stone facade rising majestically from perfectly manicured grounds. Even in the grey November light, it possessed an undeniable grandeur, though I fancied there was something almost oppressive about its symmetrical perfection, as though the very stones harbored secrets. We were met at the entrance by a butler whose bearing suggested he had been carved from the same oak as the massive front door. His announcement of our arrival brought Sir Reginald Ashworth hurrying from the depths of the house, a tall, distinguished gentleman in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of face that inspired immediate confidence. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, extending his hand with obvious relief, "I cannot express how grateful I am that you've come so quickly. This entire situation is most irregular." Poirot inclined his head with characteristic formality. "I'm at your service, Sir Reginald. You spoke of suspicious circumstances. Perhaps you would be so good as to elaborate." Sir Reginald glanced around the entrance hall, where several figures lingered in the shadows, cast by the afternoon light filtering through tall windows. "Perhaps we might speak privately first. There are delicate matters to discuss before you meet the family." We were shown into a book-lined study where Sir Reginald closed the door with obvious care before turning to face us. His expression was grave. "Monsieur Poirot, 3 days ago, the Duchess was found dead in her bed by her personal maid. Dr. Whitmore, the family physician, pronounced it heart failure, not unusual at her age. However, certain facts have since come to light that cast doubt upon the natural explanation." "Ah, oui." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "What manner of facts?" "First, the matter of the will. The Duchess was obsessively organized about her affairs. She kept copies of all important documents in a safe in this very room. When we opened it yesterday to locate her will, we found the safe completely empty, not just of the will, but of all her papers. The lock showed no signs of forcing, and only 3 people knew the combination: the Duchess herself, myself, and her companion, Miss Hartwell." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Most curious. And the second matter?" Sir Reginald hesitated. "Yesterday evening, Miss Hartwell came to me in considerable distress. She revealed that on the night of the Duchess's death, Her Grace had complained of a bitter taste in her evening cocoa. The Duchess had rung for Miss Hartwell around midnight, saying she felt most peculiar and asking for water. Miss Hartwell naturally assumed it was merely indigestion, but now you suspect poison," Poirot finished quietly. "And who, may I ask, prepared this cocoa?" That is where matters become even more complicated. Sir Reginald moved to the window, gazing out at the formal gardens. "The entire family is currently in residence, Monsieur Poirot. They had all gathered for what was to be the Duchess's birthday celebration next week. Each of them had both opportunity and—" He paused delicately. "And motive," Poirot suggested. "Precisely. The Duchess's estate is considerable and her potential heirs are numerous. Without a will, the inheritance will be divided according to the laws of intestacy, a prospect that benefits some and devastates others. Poirot arrives." At that moment, a soft knock interrupted our conversation. The butler appeared in the doorway. "Sir Reginald, the family is assembled in the drawing-room as you requested." Poirot straightened his tie and smoothed an imaginary speck from his immaculate sleeve. "Excellent. Now we shall make the acquaintance of these interesting people, each with their little secrets, their little hopes, and their little fears." The drawing-room of Witchford Abbey was a study in understated elegance, its cream-coloured walls adorned with family portraits whose subjects gazed down with the particular mixture of arrogance and ennui characteristic of the English aristocracy. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the assembled company. As we entered, 5 pairs of eyes turned toward us, with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Sir Reginald performed the introductions with practiced diplomacy. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Monsieur Hercule Poirot, the distinguished detective, and his associate, Captain Hastings. Monsieur Poirot has kindly agreed to assist us in clarifying the circumstances surrounding the Duchess's death." The first to rise was Lord Adrian Witchford, the Duchess's nephew and, in the absence of a will, her principal heir. He was a man in his early 40s, with the kind of dissolute handsomeness that spoke of too many late nights and too much brandy. His greeting was cordial enough, but I detected a nervous energy beneath his polished exterior. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, extending his hand, "I do hope this won't take long. Surely my aunt's death was perfectly natural. Tragic, of course, but hardly mysterious." Beside him stood his daughter, Miss Julia Witchford, a striking young woman of perhaps 25, with the kind of modern bob and bold manner that marked her as thoroughly contemporary. She regarded Poirot with unconcealed interest. "How thrilling!" she exclaimed. "A real detective, just like in the novels. Do you actually solve murders, Monsieur Poirot, or is that just newspaper sensationalism? Mademoiselle, Poirot replied with a slight bow, I solve puzzles. Sometimes these puzzles involve murder. Sometimes they involve more subtle forms of human wickedness. Lady Agnes Morven, the Duchess's sister, occupied a chair near the fireplace. She was a woman in her 70s, impeccably dressed, but with an air of genteel poverty that no amount of careful mending could disguise. Her son, Mr. Philip Morven, stood behind her chair, a thin, nervous man of perhaps 40 whose legal training was evident in his precise manner of speech. Monsieur Poirot, Lady Agnes said in a voice that carried the authority of breeding, I do hope you understand that this entire proceeding is quite unnecessary. My sister died peacefully in her sleep, as we all must eventually do. To suggest otherwise seems unseemly. The final member of the group was Miss Emily Hartwell, the Duchess's companion. She was a woman of middle age, quietly dressed, with intelligent grey eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. She alone did not rise to greet us, but remained seated in a corner chair, her hands folded in her lap. Poirot surveyed the assembled company with the air of a connoisseur examining a particularly fine collection. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but carried an underlying authority that commanded attention. Mesdames et messieurs, I understand your concern about my presence here. Death is always a delicate matter, and when it involves someone of the Duchess's prominence, discretion is paramount. I assure you that my only interest is in discovering the truth, whatever that truth may be. He moved to the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his egg-shaped head tilted slightly as though listening to some inner voice. Now, I have been told that the Duchess died peacefully in her sleep, and that no will can be found among her papers. These are the facts as they have been presented to me. But facts, like people, sometimes conceal as much as they reveal. With your permission, I should like to ask a few questions. Not accusations, you understand, merely clarifications. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tensions. Finally, Lord Adrian cleared his throat. Ask away, Monsieur Poirot. We have nothing to hide. Poirot's mustaches twitched slightly, a sign, I knew, of particular interest. Merci, Lord Witchford. Then perhaps we might begin with the evening of the Duchess's death. I understand the family dined together that night. Yes, replied Lady Agnes. It was quite pleasant, actually. Beatrice was in excellent spirits. And after dinner? We retired to the drawing-room for coffee, Miss Julia said. Grandmother played bridge with Lady Agnes and Mr. Morven. Father and I had a rather heated discussion about modern art, if I recall correctly. Ah, oui, Miss Hartwell. The companion looked up with a start. I helped the Duchess with her correspondence. She had several letters to write for her various charities. And what time did the Duchess retire for the evening? Shortly after 10 o'clock, Miss Hartwell replied. I helped her to her room and saw that she had everything she needed. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And this was when she mentioned the bitter taste in her cocoa? A sharp intake of breath from several members of the group suggested that this detail had not been widely known. Miss Hartwell's face flushed. Not then, Monsieur Poirot. It was later, around midnight. She rang her bell and complained of feeling unwell. She said her evening cocoa had tasted strange, bitter, almost metallic. I brought her water and she seemed to settle. And who prepared this cocoa? I did, Miss Hartwell said quietly, as I had every night for the past 5 years. The silence that followed was pregnant with implication. Poirot allowed it to stretch for several moments before speaking again. Très intéressant. Now, regarding the safe and the missing will. There is no missing will, Lord Adrian interrupted sharply. My aunt simply never got around to making one. It happens more often than you might think. Poirot's green eyes fixed upon him with laser-like intensity. But surely, monsieur, a woman of the Duchess's methodical nature would not overlook such an important matter. Sir Reginald, did the Duchess never speak to you of making a will? The solicitor shifted uncomfortably. She did, Monsieur Poirot. In fact, just 3 weeks ago, she summoned me here specifically to discuss changes she wished to make to her existing will. Changes? Lady Agnes's voice was sharp. What sort of changes? She did not elaborate, Lady Agnes. She merely said that certain recent discoveries had caused her to reconsider her previous arrangements. She asked me to return the following week with a new draft, but he spread his hands helplessly. She died before our appointment. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. I could see the calculations flickering behind each person's eyes. Hope, fear, and desperate speculation. Poirot observed these reactions with the detached interest of a scientist studying specimens. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of finality that made everyone stiffen. Mes amis, I believe we have established that the circumstances surrounding the Duchess's death are indeed worthy of investigation. Tomorrow, I shall examine the Duchess's room and the safe. I shall also speak with each of you individually. For now, I suggest we all retire and reflect upon what has been discussed. As the group began to disperse, Poirot caught my eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. The game, as he would say, was afoot. Eh bien, Hastings, he murmured as we were shown to our rooms. Already the little grey cells are intrigued. A woman who dies after complaining of bitter cocoa, a will that vanishes without trace, and a family gathering that includes every possible suspect. C'est magnifique, is it not? Tomorrow we shall see what other secrets Wychford Abbey has to offer. The morning brought a grey Surrey dawn that filtered weakly through the mullioned windows of Wychford Abbey. Poirot emerged from his room precisely at 7, his appearance immaculate despite the early hour. I found him in the breakfast room, regarding a plate of kippers with the same intensity he might apply to a crucial piece of evidence. Bon matin, Hastings, he murmured, dabbing his lips with mathematical precision. The household stirs early today. I've observed 3 separate figures moving through the corridors since dawn, each, I suspect, pursuing their own private concerns. Most illuminating. Have you formed any theories yet? I inquired, settling beside him with my own breakfast. Theories, no. Observations, certainement. But first, we must examine the scene more thoroughly. The dead speak to those who know how to listen, and I fancy the Duchess has much to tell us. Within the hour, we were conducted to the Duchess's bedroom by the impassive butler. The chamber was spacious and elegant, decorated in deep burgundy and gold, with heavy furniture that spoke of generations of wealth and refinement. Poirot moved through the space with the deliberate grace of a cat, his eyes missing nothing. You observe, Hastings, the character revealed in every detail, he said softly, indicating the perfectly aligned books on the nightstand, the precisely folded clothes visible through the wardrobe's open door. This was a woman of absolute order, of method. Such a person does not simply forget to secure her most important documents. He approached the bedside table, his magnifying glass appearing as if by magic. The polished mahogany surface bore only a lamp and a small lace doily, but Poirot's attention fixed upon something I could barely perceive. Regardez, mon ami. Here, beneath the lace, a faint ring where moisture has marked the wood. A cup stood here recently, but it has been removed. He straightened, his expression thoughtful. Miss Hartwell mentioned washing the cocoa cup the morning after the death. Most natural, perhaps, but also most inconvenient for our investigation. Moving to the window, he examined the heavy curtains with interest before turning his attention to a small door in the corner. The safe, he announced, producing a key Sir Reginald had provided. The metal door swung open to reveal empty shelves, their surfaces gleaming dully in the morning light. Poirot withdrew his magnifying glass once more, examining the interior with minute care. After several moments, he made a small sound of satisfaction. Most interesting. The interior has been wiped clean, recently and thoroughly. But why Hastings? If one wears gloves to avoid fingerprints, there would be nothing to wipe. This suggests our thief acted impulsively, touched the metal with bare hands, then realized the error. Someone familiar with the house then. Précisément, someone who knew the combination, who had legitimate access, but who acted in a moment of panic or opportunity. He closed the safe with a decisive click. Now we must speak with those who possessed such access. Miss Hartwell appeared at our summons, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them before her. Poirot guided her to a chair with gentle courtesy before settling across from her, his manner both kind and inexorably penetrating. Mademoiselle, you have served the Duchess faithfully for many years. You knew her habits, her concerns, her fears. In recent weeks, did she seem troubled about anything particular? She had been different, Miss Hartwell admitted reluctantly. More secretive, more watchful. She spent long hours going through old papers, old letters, and she had been asking questions about the family's finances, about Lord Adrian's debts. Ah, oui? And what did she discover? I'm not certain, but 3 weeks ago she received a letter that upset her greatly. She burned it immediately, but afterward she summoned Sir Reginald to discuss changing her will. She said someone had been deceiving her, that she had been played for a fool by someone she trusted. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Did she indicate who this someone might be? Miss Hartwell shook her head. She would not say, but she was very angry. I had never seen her in such a state. And the night she died, you prepared the cocoa as usual. Yes, in the small kitchenette. But when I brought it to her, she seemed agitated, almost fearful. She drank only half before complaining of the bitter taste. You saw no one else that evening? Heard nothing unusual? Only footsteps in the corridor around midnight after I had helped her to bed. Someone pacing, restless. Poirot rose, his expression grave. Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. As she departed, he turned to me with evident satisfaction. The picture begins to clarify, Hastings. Someone in this house had much to lose from the Duchess's discoveries. Now we must determine who possessed both opportunity and desperation sufficient for murder. Lord Adrian Witchford awaited us in the library, his appearance suggesting a man who had spent a restless night. The morning light revealed the telltale signs of dissolution. Bloodshot eyes, trembling hands, the pallor of chronic anxiety poorly concealed beneath aristocratic bearing. Monsieur Poirot, he said, attempting his usual charm, I trust you slept well. These old houses can be rather draughty. Merci, Lord Witchford. I slept adequately. Poirot settled into his chair with deliberate precision. Now, shall we discuss your financial difficulties? The mask slipped momentarily. I beg your pardon. Your gambling debts, monsieur. They are considerable, are they not? And the creditors grow impatient. Adrian's jaw tightened. My private affairs are hardly relevant to my aunt's death. Au contraire, when a man owes £30,000 to bookmakers who are not known for their patience, and his wealthy aunt speaks of changing her will, such matters become most relevant indeed. How did you... Adrian caught himself, then laughed, bitterly. Of course. Nothing remains secret in a house like this. Yes, I owe money. Yes, my aunt knew. She'd bailed me out before, but recently she'd grown difficult about it. She threatened to disinherit you. She threatened many things. But she'd never actually do it. I was her heir, her legacy. Without me, the Witchford name dies with her generation. Poirot's eyes glinted. And yet she summoned Sir Reginald to change her will. Most curious behavior for a woman who would never disinherit you. Adrian's composure cracked entirely. She was angry about something, suspicious, paranoid. She accused me of forging her signature on checks, of stealing from her charities. Ridiculous accusations, but she seemed convinced. Where were you on the night of her death after she retired? In the smoking room with Philip until nearly midnight. We were discussing estate matters. Rather heated discussions, actually. Philip believes in economy. I believe in living. You did not leave this room. Only briefly, around 11:30, to fetch some papers from my study. I was gone perhaps 10 minutes. After Adrian's departure, Philip Morven entered with the nervous energy of a man perpetually calculating odds. His thin frame seemed to vibrate with anxiety as he perched on the edge of his chair. "Mr. Morven," Poirot began gently, "you're in a delicate position. As a solicitor, you understand the implications of intestacy better than most." Philip adjusted his spectacles nervously. "Indeed, under the current circumstances, my mother and I receive only a modest portion of the estate. It's insufficient for our needs. But under the previous will—" "I don't know the specific terms," Philip said carefully, "but my mother was to be provided for more generously. The Duchess had promised her security in old age." "And you believe this promise would be honored?" "Until recently, yes. But 3 weeks ago, the Duchess began asking pointed questions about the family's finances, about discrepancies in the charity accounts. She seemed to suspect irregularities." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "What sort of irregularities?" "I'm not certain. She mentioned missing funds, forged signatures. She was gathering documentation, she said, to present to the authorities. Most alarming for someone with access to those accounts." Philip's face flushed. "If you're suggesting I embezzled from charity funds, I suggest nothing, monsieur. I merely observe that you confirm Lord Adrian's presence in the smoking room that evening." "Yes, from shortly after 10 until midnight, though he did step out briefly around 11:30. When Julia Witchford joined us, she brought an air of modern confidence that contrasted sharply with her male relative's anxiety. She settled gracefully, lighting a cigarette with steady hands. "Miss Julia," Poirot said, "you were close to your grandmother." "As close as one could be to a woman who lived in the last century. But I respected her intelligence, her strength. She was nobody's fool." "Did she confide in you about her suspicions regarding the family finances?" Julia's eyes sharpened. "She did, actually. 2 weeks ago, she told me she'd discovered someone had been systematically stealing from her charitable foundations. She was furious, not just about the money, but about the betrayal of trust." "Did she name the culprit?" "No, but she said she was gathering evidence. She seemed almost pleased, as though she'd been waiting to catch someone in a trap." "And the night of her death?" "I was in my room, writing letters. But, Monsieur Poirot, I heard something disturbing around 11:30. Voices from the direction of grandmother's wing, low but intense, clearly arguing." "You recognize the voices?" "One was definitely male, but I couldn't identify which man." As Julia departed, Poirot steepled his fingers thoughtfully. "Très intéressant, Hastings. Each interview reveals another layer of deception, another motive. Someone in this house had much to fear from the Duchess's investigations." Lady Agnes Morven entered the library with the imperious bearing of a woman accustomed to command, though her worn black dress and carefully mended gloves betrayed the genteel poverty that had become her constant companion. She settled into the chair with rigid dignity, her spine straight as a ramrod. "Monsieur Poirot, I trust this interview will be brief. I find these proceedings most distasteful." "Madame, I shall be as expeditious as possible. You were your sister's closest living relative. Did she discuss her financial arrangements with you?" Lady Agnes's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "Beatrice and I had not been close for many years. She married wealth. I married for love. She never forgave me for what she considered an unsuitable match. Yet you resided here frequently." "At her sufferance, yes." The words carried decades of accumulated bitterness. She enjoyed demonstrating her superiority, her generosity. Every meal, every garment, every small comfort was a reminder of my dependence. But I endured it for Philip's sake. He deserved better than poverty. And when the Duchess spoke of changing her will, Lady Agnes's composure cracked slightly. She didn't speak of it to me directly, but I overheard her conversation with Sir Reginald. She said she'd been deceived, that certain people had taken advantage of her generosity. We stood to lose everything. Where were you on the evening of her death? Playing bridge in the drawing room until 10 o'clock. Afterward, I retired to my room with a headache. I took a sleeping draught and heard nothing until morning. After Lady Agnes departed, Poirot summoned the butler, who appeared with his usual impassive efficiency. Graves, you have served this family for many years. On the night of the Duchess's death, did you observe anything unusual? The butler hesitated, a rare crack in his professional demeanor. I did note that the small kitchenette where Miss Hartwell prepared the Duchess's evening cocoa was used twice that evening. Poirot's mustaches quivered with interest. Ah oui, please explain. Miss Hartwell prepared the cocoa at 9:30, as was customary. But when I passed the kitchenette around 10:15, I noticed the milk pan had been used again. It was still warm, and there was a faint residue in a second cup. Someone prepared a second cup of cocoa. Did you see who? No, sir, but I found it peculiar. The kitchenette is rarely used except by Miss Hartwell for the Duchess's evening drink. And this second cup, what became of it? I cannot say, sir. By morning all the cups had been washed. As Graves withdrew, Sir Reginald appeared at the library door, his face grave. Monsieur Poirot, I've just received word from Dr. Whitmore. He's completed a more thorough examination at my request. He found traces of digitalis in the Duchess's system, far more than could be explained by her prescribed heart medication. Digitalis, Poirot murmured. The poison of the foxglove. In small doses, a medicine. In larger doses, a killer that mimics heart failure perfectly. Exactly. And there's more. Sir Reginald produced a small glass vial, empty but bearing a faded pharmaceutical label. The maid found this wedged behind the radiator in the Duchess's room. It once contained digitalis tablets. Poirot examined the vial with his magnifying glass. No fingerprints, naturally. But this confirms murder, deliberate and premeditated. Then we must notify the police immediately, Sir Reginald urged. Not yet, mon ami. First, we must understand the complete picture. Poirot moved to the window, gazing out at the formal gardens. Someone prepared a second cup, perhaps to replace the first, perhaps to test something. But why not simply add poison to the existing cup? Before I could respond, Julia Witchford appeared at the door, her face pale but determined. Monsieur Poirot, I've been thinking about those voices I heard arguing. I remembered something else. One phrase, quite distinct. A man's voice said, "You can't do this to me." It sounded frightened, almost desperate. Très intéressant, Poirot murmured. Fear and desperation, the twin engines of murder. Tell me, Sir Reginald, about the safe. Could there have been another key? The solicitor hesitated. Well, technically, yes. The late Duke kept a spare key in his study, in a hidden compartment of his desk, but I assumed it was lost years ago. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Let us verify this assumption. In the Duke's study, Poirot's fingers found the concealed spring mechanism. The small drawer popped open with a soft click, revealing nothing but dust. Empty, I breathed. Someone knew about the spare key. Indeed, Hastings. Someone who planned carefully, who knew the household intimately. Tomorrow, we shall see how deep these waters truly run. The following morning brought developments that seemed to clarify the case while simultaneously deepening its mysteries. I found Poirot in the conservatory, at dawn, examining the Duchess's prized foxgloves with the intensity of a botanist. Several plants showed signs of recent disturbance, their distinctive purple blooms drooping where leaves had been stripped away. Voilà, Hastings. Someone has been harvesting digitalis. But when, and for what purpose? His green eyes glinted with interest. The clever poisoner might prepare their weapon from natural sources, leaving no pharmaceutical trail. Our contemplation was interrupted by Graves, who appeared with his customary discretion. Monsieur Poirot, Inspector Marsh from the county police has arrived. He wishes to speak with you urgently." Inspector Marsh proved to be a solid, methodical man whose skeptical glance suggested he had little patience for foreign detectives. He accepted our presence with grudging courtesy before producing a manila folder thick with documents. "Monsieur Poirot, we've been investigating the financial irregularities Sir Reginald mentioned. The evidence against Philip Morvant is substantial." He spread papers across the conservatory table. Forged signatures on charity checks, unauthorized transfers, false invoices, nearly £20,000 diverted over 3 years. Poirot examined the documents with his magnifying glass. "The forgeries are skillful, Inspector. Someone with legal training, perhaps?" "Exactly. And yesterday the village pharmacist came forward. 6 weeks ago, someone presented a prescription for digitalis tablets, supposedly written by Dr. Whitmore. The description matches Morvan perfectly. Thin, nervous, spectacles. Dr. Whitmore confirms he wrote no such prescription. Categorically denies it. The signature's forged, just like the charity documents." Marsh's satisfaction was evident. "We also found this." He produced a small brass key, its surface gleaming despite obvious attempts at cleaning. "Hidden in Morvan's room, wrapped in a handkerchief. Matches the spare key to the Duchess's safe perfectly." I felt a chill of recognition. The key from the Duke's study. Philip knew about the hidden compartment. As the family solicitor's son, he'd grown up in this house, Marsh confirmed. He knew every secret passage and hiding place. On the night of the murder, he slipped away from the smoking room, used the key to access the safe, destroyed the incriminating evidence in the new will, then returned to establish his alibi with Lord Adrian. "And the murder itself?" Poirot inquired softly. "Simple enough. He prepared the poisoned cocoa, that explains the second cup your butler mentioned, waited for Miss Hartwell to deliver the first cup, then convinced the Duchess to drink his preparation instead. Perhaps he claimed hers had grown cold, or that he'd brought her a special remedy." The inspector's case seemed watertight, yet something in Poirot's expression suggested profound skepticism. "You have arrested Mr. Morvan." "This morning. He's confessed to the embezzlement but denies the murder. Claims someone planted the key in his room." Marsh snorted derisively. The usual protests of innocence. As if summoned by our conversation, Miss Hartwell appeared at the conservatory entrance, her face pale with distress. "Monsieur Poirot, I found something. After Philip's arrest, I remembered. The Duchess gave me a letter the day before she died. I was so frightened after her death that I hid it." She produced a cream envelope bearing the Duchess's monogram. The letter, in the Duchess's firm handwriting, was brief but damning. "Emily, I have confronted the person who has been stealing from my charities. They have promised restitution, but I fear they may attempt something desperate. If anything happens to me, the evidence is hidden where only you would think to look. Trust no one else." "Where only you would think to look," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. The hollow base of her favorite statue, the marble Venus. She kept private papers there sometimes. Miss Hartwell's voice trembled. "I checked this morning. There was a green ledger with all the financial records, proving the thefts." Inspector Marsh seized the letter with evident satisfaction. "Perfect. This confirms Morvan knew he'd been discovered. Murder was his only escape." Yet Poirot's expression remained troubled. "Mes amis, I confess myself puzzled by certain details. A man clever enough to forge documents and plan systematic embezzlement. Does such a person keep incriminating evidence in his bedroom like a schoolboy's contraband? Does he leave poison vials where any maid might find them? Criminals make mistakes under pressure," Marsh replied firmly. "Peut-être. But this criminal seems to have made every possible mistake at precisely the right moment to ensure his capture. It strikes me as convenient." Poirot moved to the window, his reflection wavering in the morning glass. "Tomorrow, Inspector, we shall see what other conveniences this case provides." I suspect the truth lies deeper than even the cleverest evidence suggests. The news of Philip Morven's arrest rippled through Witchford Abbey like a stone cast into still water, creating circles of reaction that revealed as much as they concealed. By afternoon, Poirot had requested the use of the morning room, and one by one the remaining inhabitants filed through to face his penetrating questions. Lord Adrian entered first, his demeanor notably lighter than in previous days. He settled into his chair with an almost jaunty air that struck me as entirely inappropriate given his cousin's predicament. "Well, Monsieur Poirot," he began with expansive satisfaction, "it seems the mystery is solved rather neatly. Philip was always a devious little wretch. Never could trust him with figures. You seem remarkably cheerful, monsieur, for a man whose cousin faces the gallows." Adrian's smile wavered slightly. "Philip made his bed, didn't he? Besides, this clears up the inheritance situation rather conveniently. With Philip disqualified by his crimes, the estate reverts entirely to me." "Ah, oui? But you are very certain of his guilt. Tell me, do you truly believe your cousin capable of cold-blooded murder?" "Capable?" Adrian laughed harshly. "Philip's a coward, Monsieur Poirot, but cornered cowards can be dangerous. Still," he paused, his bravado faltering, "I'll admit, poison seems rather sophisticated for someone who jumps at shadows." Julia entered next, her modern confidence intact, but her eyes troubled. She lit a cigarette with steady hands before settling gracefully into the chair. "So they've caught their convenient villain," she said, exhaling smoke thoughtfully. "Inspector Marsh must be pleased with how neatly everything fits." "You sound skeptical, mademoiselle. Philip's weak, yes. Foolish, greedy, easily bullied. But calculating enough for murder? And that voice I heard arguing, I've been thinking about it. Philip's voice is thin, reedy. The man I heard sounded older, rougher, more desperate." Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. "You are certain it was not Mr. Morven?" "As certain as I am that you suspect someone else entirely." Lady Agnes appeared without summons, her usually controlled features ravaged by strain. "Is it true?" she demanded. "Have they really arrested my Philip?" "Madame, please sit. We must discuss certain inconsistencies." "Inconsistencies?" Hope flared in her eyes, desperate and fierce. "Indeed, your son is accused of preparing poisoned cocoa, yet he was in the smoking room with Lord Adrian from 10 o'clock onward. The second cup was prepared at 10:15. How could he accomplish this?" "But he left briefly around 11:30, Adrian interjected quickly. "For 10 minutes to fetch papers. Not sufficient time to prepare cocoa, climb to the Duchess's wing, convince her to drink poison, and return." Poirot's voice carried quiet authority. "No, the second cocoa was prepared earlier, by someone else." Lady Agnes gripped her chair. "Then you know he didn't do it. You know he's being framed." "The evidence suggests it, madame. But we require proof." Poirot rose decisively. "Hastings, we must examine the linen closet adjacent to the Duchess's room." In the narrow closet, Poirot systematically searched through perfectly folded sheets and towels. Suddenly, he froze, withdrawing a small, crumpled handkerchief from beneath a stack of lavender-scented linens. "Regardez, Hastings. Someone spilled something here and wiped it hastily." He held the fabric to the light, revealing dark stains and an embroidered monogram in the corner. A.W. I sniffed cautiously. Beneath the chocolate aroma lay a faint, bitter scent, chemical and sharp. "Digitalis," Poirot confirmed grimly. "The poison was spilled here during preparation. But why hide the evidence in this particular location? Because the perpetrator knew the household routines, knew this closet would provide temporary concealment. The monogram? Adrian Witchford. Or simply Witchford Abbey, as many household linens bear. But the location of concealment suggests intimate knowledge of the house's geography and schedules. As we returned to the main corridor, Poirot's expression had transformed from puzzlement to grim certainty. The psychological game begins now, Hastings. Someone in this house has orchestrated an elaborate deception using Mr. Morven's genuine crimes as cover for murder. They have been clever, methodical, but not quite clever enough. He paused at the foot of the grand staircase, his green eyes glinting with that familiar light of impending revelation. Tomorrow we shall gather them all together. The true murderer believes themselves safe behind their convenient scapegoat. It is time to prove them most terribly wrong. The morning brought news that transformed the case from puzzling to sinister. Miss Hartwell had vanished during the night, leaving behind only her handbag, discovered by a groundskeeper among the reeds near the ornamental lake. Inspector Marsh arrived within the hour, his earlier confidence shaken by this unexpected development. "Her bed hasn't been slept in," he reported grimly. "The servants assumed she'd retired with a headache, but she's nowhere to be found." Poirot examined the sodden handbag with meticulous care. Inside, among the usual feminine accessories, lay a return ticket to London dated for the previous day. "Someone wished it to appear she had fled," he observed quietly. But Miss Hartwell was not the fleeing type. She was loyal, methodical, and she knew something that made her dangerous. By afternoon, the lake had yielded its grim secret. Emily Hartwell's body was recovered from the murky waters, tangled in weeds near the far shore. Dr. Whitmore's examination revealed bruises on her wrists that spoke eloquently of struggle, though the official cause remained drowning. "She remembered something crucial," Poirot murmured as we stood beside the lake. "Perhaps about the cocoa preparation or the voices she heard that night, and she paid the ultimate price for her knowledge." The second death sent shockwaves through the remaining inhabitants of Witchford Abbey. Lady Agnes confined herself to her room, refusing all visitors. Lord Adrian paced the corridors like a caged animal, his earlier bravado replaced by visible anxiety. Even Julia's modern composure showed cracks under the mounting strain. In the library, Poirot gathered the survivors with unusual solemnity. "We no longer deal merely with a clever murderer protecting an inheritance," he announced. "We face a desperate killer who will eliminate anyone threatening their freedom." Sir Reginald, summoned at Poirot's request, provided crucial context. "Monsieur Poirot, I feel I must reveal what the Duchess told me about her will changes. She intended to disinherit Lord Adrian entirely, citing not just his gambling debts, but his moral bankruptcy. She believed he was orchestrating the charity thefts, using Philip's legal skills while collecting the money himself." Adrian's face flushed dangerously. "That's preposterous. Philip was the thief. The evidence proves it." "The evidence proves Philip forged signatures," Poirot corrected gently. "But the Duchess had discovered that your gambling debts were paid using funds matching precisely the amount stolen. She was gathering documentation to prove your involvement when she died." Before Adrian could respond, Inspector Marsh entered bearing a small leather diary. "Found this hidden in Miss Hartwell's room. The final entry is illuminating," he read aloud. "I know who it is. I saw them coming out of the Duchess's room that night just before midnight. I was groggy from the cocoa, but I saw the dressing gown, blue silk with gold dragons. I must tell Monsieur Poirot, but I'm afraid." The silence was suffocating. All eyes turned toward Lord Adrian, who stood frozen by the fireplace. "Blue silk with gold dragons." Poirot repeated thoughtfully, "A distinctive garment, Lord Witchford. One I observed in your wardrobe yesterday." "Half the men in London own similar dressing gowns," Adrian protested, his voice cracking. "It's a popular pattern." "Perhaps, but Miss Hartwell was certain enough to record it, certain enough to fear for her life." Poirot's green eyes glinted. "Tell me, what did you discuss when you visited the Duchess's room that night?" Adrian's composure shattered completely. "I went to beg for money, yes. She threatened to expose everything, to ruin me completely. But she was alive when I left, alive and furious." At that moment, the library door burst open. Philip Morven stood there, disheveled and breathless, flanked by two constables who had escorted him from his cell. "Stop!" he gasped. "You're arresting the wrong man. Adrian couldn't have killed my aunt. I was watching his door all night, hoping to catch him stealing from the safe. He never left his room after midnight." Poirot turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "You were watching Mr. Morven. How very interesting. Then who, I wonder, was the figure in the blue silk dressing gown that Miss Hartwell saw leaving the Duchess's room?" The question hung in the air like a sword, while outside, storm clouds gathered over Wychford Abbey, promising revelations as dark as the approaching tempest. The revelation struck the assembled company like lightning. Philip Morven, disheveled from his cell but speaking with desperate conviction, had shattered the carefully constructed case against Lord Adrian with a single, devastating alibi. Inspector Marsh recovered first, his face flushed with indignation. "You claim you watched Lord Adrian's door all night. Why didn't you mention this crucial detail during questioning?" Philip's hands trembled as he faced the room. "Because I was there to catch him stealing from the safe. I thought he was embezzling from the charities, using my forged signatures as cover. Anything I said in his defense would sound self-serving." "Yet you speak now," Poirot observed quietly, "when another death has shown you how close the gallows truly stand." "I cannot let an innocent man hang for my cowardice," Philip replied, his voice breaking. "Adrian visited our aunt before midnight. I saw him return to his room around 11:45. After that, his door never opened. I watched until dawn." The silence that followed was suffocating. Poirot moved to the center of the room, his green eyes glinting with that familiar intensity that preceded revelation. "Mes amis, we have been observing this tragedy through the wrong lens entirely. If Lord Adrian remained in his room after midnight, yet Miss Hartwell saw someone in his distinctive dressing gown leaving the Duchess's chamber, what does this tell us?" "Someone else wore my dressing gown," Adrian exclaimed, hope flickering in his eyes. "Someone trying to frame me." "Precisamente, but consider the psychology required for such deception. The killer needed intimate knowledge of your habits, your wardrobe, your vulnerabilities. They required access to both the family quarters and the servants' areas without arousing suspicion." Julia crushed her cigarette with unnecessary force. "Someone who knew the house intimately. Someone we would never suspect." Poirot nodded approvingly. "The handkerchief we discovered in the linen closet bears the monogram A.W. Everyone assumed it belonged to Adrian Wychford. But there is another possibility, one that changes everything. He produced the stained fabric, holding it to the light. Agnes Wychford, the Duchess's maiden name, which would appear on older household linens stored in the back of the closet. Someone familiar with the house from childhood would know exactly where such items were kept." Lady Agnes, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "This is pure speculation, Monsieur Poirot. That handkerchief could belong to anyone." "Could it, madame? Then explain why it was hidden in the one location where you spent countless hours as a child, the linen closet where you helped your mother organize the household stores. Explain why it bears traces of both cocoa and digitalis, suggesting someone spilled the poison during preparation." The color drained from Lady Agnes's face, but her aristocratic bearing remained intact. "I was sedated with sleeping draughts that evening. The entire household knows this." "You claimed to take sleeping draughts," Poirot corrected gently. "But the maid who turned down your bed noticed the medicine bottle remained full the next morning. She mentioned this detail to Graves, who mentioned it to me." Philip stared at his mother with dawning horror. "Mother, tell him it isn't true." But Lady Agnes merely straightened her spine, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the window. The gesture spoke volumes. Pride warring with desperation, breeding with necessity. Poirot continued his inexorable logic. "You pretended to retire, then used the servants' staircase to access the kitchenette unobserved. You prepared the poisoned cocoa, knowing Miss Hartwell's precise routine. When she delivered the innocent cup, You appeared with your own preparation, perhaps claiming hers had grown cold. "And the dressing gown?" Sir Reginald asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A masterful touch of misdirection. You wore something similar, perhaps an old garment from your late husband's wardrobe, ensuring you would be glimpsed from behind in the dim corridor. The pattern was distinctive enough for identification, but Miss Hartwell never saw your face clearly. The room held its breath as Poirot's words settled like dust after an explosion. Lady Agnes remained motionless, but something in her eyes suggested the walls were closing in. "Tomorrow," Poirot announced with quiet finality, "we shall see how deep these waters truly run. The truth, mes amis, has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully it has been submerged." The gathering dispersed in stunned silence, each person wrestling with the implications of what had been revealed. Outside, storm clouds continued to gather over Witchford Abbey, promising a reckoning as inevitable as the approaching dawn. The storm that had threatened all afternoon finally broke during the night, unleashing a fury that seemed to mirror the tempest raging within Witchford Abbey's ancient walls. Rain lashed against the mullioned windows with relentless intensity, while wind moaned through the corridors like the voices of the wronged demanding justice. I found Poirot in the library at dawn, standing motionless before the rain-streaked windows, his small figure reflected ghostly in the grey light. "The final act approaches, Hastings," he said without turning. "Today, the mask falls away, and we shall see the face of murder revealed in all its tragic clarity." By 9 o'clock, Inspector Marsh had arrived, bringing with him the oppressive weight of official authority. At Poirot's request, the entire household assembled in the great hall, that magnificent chamber where generations of Witchfords had held court. The black and white marble floor gleamed beneath the light of every lamp and candelabra, while ancestral portraits gazed down with expressions that seemed to anticipate the drama about to unfold. They gathered in a semicircle before the massive fireplace, Lord Adrian, pale and haggard from his recent ordeal, Julia maintaining her modern composure despite the strain visible in her eyes, Philip, released from custody but bearing the weight of his admitted crimes, Lady Agnes, still regal in bearing despite the shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, Sir Reginald, grave with the burden of family secrets, and the household staff, wide-eyed witnesses to the unfolding tragedy. Poirot took his position at the center of the semicircle, his green eyes surveying each face with the intensity of a master craftsman examining his work. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the echoing chamber, each word measured and deliberate. The elimination of suspects. Mesdames et messieurs, we have endured 2 deaths, false accusations, and much confusion. The time has come to dispel the fog of deception that has shrouded this house. Let us begin with what we know to be true. He moved with characteristic precision, his hands clasped behind his back. 3 weeks ago, the Duchess discovered systematic theft from her charitable foundations. The evidence pointed clearly to Mr. Philip Morven, whose legal skills made the forgeries possible. Yet when I examined the pattern of these thefts, I discovered something most illuminating. They coincided precisely with periods when someone else in this household faced financial crisis. Philip's face flushed with shame, but he remained silent. The Duchess, being thorough, began documenting every irregularity. She kept a secret ledger hidden in the hollow base of her beloved Venus statue. But this ledger contained more than proof of forgery. It revealed the true orchestrator of the scheme. Poirot paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. On the night of her death, we know that 2 cups of cocoa were prepared. The first innocent cup was made by Miss Hartwell at 9:30. The second, containing digitalis extracted from the conservatory's foxgloves, was prepared at 10:15 by someone with intimate knowledge of the house and its routines. The physical evidence. He produced the stained handkerchief, holding it to the light. This fabric, found hidden in the linen closet, bears traces of both chocolate and digitalis. The monogram AW led us initially to suspect Lord Adrian, but the location of its concealment told a different story. Only someone who had spent childhood hours in that closet, helping organize household linens, would know it as a hiding place. Lady Agnes's knuckles whitened on her walking stick, but her aristocratic bearing remained intact. The blue silk dressing gown with gold dragons, distinctive enough to ensure identification, yet worn by someone who knew they would be glimpsed only from behind in dim corridor lighting. Miss Hartwell saw what she expected to see: Lord Adrian's dressing gown leaving the Duchess's room. But appearances, mes amis, can be most carefully arranged. The psychological portrait. Poirot's voice grew gentler, almost compassionate. Lady Agnes, you have lived your entire adult life in the shadow of your sister's wealth and success. Every comfort you enjoyed came as charity, every meal a reminder of dependence. For decades you endured this humiliation, not for yourself, but for your son's future. Many women have endured worse, Lady Agnes replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Poverty with dignity is no crime. None, but murder is. When the Duchess discovered Philip's forgeries, she summoned Sir Reginald to change her will. But you had overheard something more devastating. She had realized that while Philip forged the signatures, you had orchestrated the entire scheme. You directed which charities to target, when to strike, how to cover the thefts. The pattern was too methodical, too strategic for a mere embezzler. The color drained from Lady Agnes's face, but she maintained her rigid posture. You knew she planned to expose you both. Philip would face imprisonment, disgrace, ruin. Everything you had sacrificed, every humiliation you had endured for his sake, all would be for nothing. So you decided she must die. The confession. The silence that followed was broken only by the storm raging outside. Lady Agnes sat motionless for long moments, her aristocratic mask finally beginning to crack. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of accumulated resentment. Beatrice had everything: wealth, position, respect. She could have helped us generously, without conditions, without the constant reminders of our dependence. Instead, she enjoyed watching us grovel, delighted in our humiliation. Tears began to stream down her weathered cheeks, though her spine remained straight. I did what any mother would do. I protected my son. The sleeping draught provided perfect cover. Everyone believed me unconscious while the murder occurred. I used the servants' staircase to reach the kitchenette unobserved, prepared the poisoned cocoa, and waited. And Miss Hartwell? Poirot asked gently. She began remembering details, asking questions. I saw suspicion growing in her eyes. When she requested that private meeting by the lake, Lady Agnes's voice broke entirely. I struck her from behind, held her beneath the water until she ceased, struggling. 2 lives, Monsieur Poirot, to secure my son's future. Philip collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands. Mother, how could you? I would have faced prison gladly rather than this. You don't understand, Lady Agnes whispered, her composure finally shattered. I did it all for you, to give you the life you deserved. Everything was for you. Everything was for your pride, Poirot corrected with infinite sadness. And now 2 innocent women are dead, a family is destroyed, and the inheritance you sought will be forever tainted by blood. Justice served. As Inspector Marsh moved forward with the handcuffs, Lady Agnes rose with what remained of her dignity. She looked once around the great hall, at the portraits of ancestors who had built this legacy through honor rather than murder, and seemed to age decades in that single moment. I regret nothing, she said quietly, though her voice betrayed the lie. Except that I was not clever enough to escape Hercule Poirot's little grey cells. As she was led away, the storm outside began to abate, leaving only the gentle patter of rain against the windows, like tears for the tragic waste of 2 lives and the destruction of an ancient family's honor. The case was closed, but the echoes of its tragedy would resonate through Witchford Abbey for generations to come. The afternoon following Lady Agnes's arrest brought an unexpected stillness to Witchford Abbey, as though the great house itself had finally exhaled after holding its breath through weeks of deception and death. The remaining family gathered in the library one final time, not for accusations now, but for the quiet reckoning that follows revelation. Lord Adrian stood by the tall windows, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching humility. The grey November light seemed to age him, revealing the dissolution that wealth and privilege had long concealed. "Monsieur Poirot," he said without turning, "I find myself in the peculiar position of owing my life to a man I barely know. Had you not seen through my aunt's deception, I should have hanged for her crimes." "C'est la vérité," Poirot acknowledged gently. "But perhaps this experience will serve as what you English call a wake-up call, no? The gambling, the debts, these weaknesses made you a perfect scapegoat." Adrian's laugh was bitter, but not without hope. "Indeed. I'm selling the London house to pay my creditors and taking a position with a shipping firm in Singapore. Time to make my own way, as I should have done years ago." Julia joined them, her modern composure intact, but her eyes reflecting new wisdom. "I've been accepted to read law at Oxford," she announced. "Grandmother would have approved, I think. She always said women needed independence more than jewels." "Très bien, mademoiselle. You have learned that dependence, from any direction, can be dangerous." Philip Morven entered quietly, his thin frame seeming even more fragile in the aftermath of his mother's confession. "Prison awaits me, naturally," he said with quiet resignation. 3 to 5 years, Sir Reginald estimates, for the forgeries. Perhaps it's what I deserve. I was too weak to refuse her schemes, too frightened to expose them. "Yet in the end," Poirot observed, "you found courage. Your testimony saved an innocent man. That counts for something in the moral ledger, n'est-ce pas?" Sir Reginald cleared his throat diplomatically. "The Duchess's true will has been located, Monsieur Poirot, filed with a London solicitor as backup. She was more cautious than we realized. The bulk goes to her charitable foundations, with modest provisions for family members who demonstrate moral character and financial responsibility. The trustees will have interesting decisions ahead." As the others departed to begin their separate journeys toward redemption or ruin, Poirot moved to the window where afternoon sunlight broke through dissipating clouds, casting golden shafts across the formal gardens where the Duchess had once walked in happier times. "A tragic affair, Hastings," he murmured. "2 women dead, a family destroyed, all because pride and resentment festered until they poisoned everything they touched." "But you solved it brilliantly," I offered. "The psychological deductions, the careful elimination." "Non, mon ami. There is no brilliance in revealing such human weakness." His green eyes reflected profound sadness. "Lady Agnes was not born a murderer. She was created by years of humiliation, by a society that valued wealth over character, by a sister who wielded charity like a weapon." Before we departed, Graves appeared with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Monsieur Poirot, Lady Agnes asked me to give you this. She said you would understand." Inside was a leather-bound volume of Tennyson, inscribed in faded ink. "To Agnes, with love from Beatrice, Christmas 1898. "A reminder," Poirot said softly, "of a time before resentment poisoned their bond. Before money and pride destroyed 2 sisters who once loved one another." As our motor car pulled away from Witchford Abbey, I looked back at the magnificent house rising from the evening mist. It stood as imposing as ever, its stone walls keeping their remaining secrets, its windows reflecting the setting sun like watching eyes. "The little grey cells have solved another puzzle," I observed. "Oui, but they cannot restore the dead, cannot undo the damage wrought by years of accumulated bitterness." Poirot settled back against the cushions, his face serene but melancholy. They can only illuminate the darkness and hope that others learn from the tragedy they reveal. The countryside rolled past in the gathering dusk, peaceful now after the storm. In the distance, church bells chimed the evening hour, their bronze voices carrying across fields where nothing had changed, where life continued its eternal rhythm despite the human drama that had played out behind Witchford's ancient walls. And what have we learned, Poirot? His moustaches twitched slightly. That pride and resentment are poisons as deadly as any digitalis, mon ami. That the human heart, when starved of dignity and respect, can justify the most terrible crimes. He paused, watching the familiar London skyline emerge from the twilight. And that sometimes the greatest mysteries are not who committed the crime, but why decent people allow themselves to become monsters. The case was closed, but its sadness would linger long after the files were sealed and the newspapers moved on to fresher scandals. Justice had been served, but as Hercule Poirot often observed, justice and peace are not always the same thing. 3 months after Lady Agnes's conviction, an unexpected visitor arrived at our London flat. Philip Morven appeared vastly changed from the nervous wretch we had last encountered. Prison had stripped away his essential weakness, leaving someone harder but somehow more substantial. His eyes, once perpetually downcast, now met ours with quiet determination. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," he began, settling into the offered chair. "I've been released pending final sentencing. The judge considered my cooperation as mitigation, but I come bearing something that changes everything we thought we understood about my mother's crimes." He withdrew a worn envelope with trembling hands. "She left me a letter, to be opened only after her trial concluded. She was sentenced to hang yesterday." Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest as Philip unfolded the pages. "She confessed everything in writing, not just the murders, but the systematic campaign that preceded them. For months, she had been administering small doses of digitalis to the Duchess, weakening her heart gradually. The final dose was merely the culmination of a long, calculated poisoning. The revelation struck us like a physical blow. Even Poirot, who had witnessed humanity's darkest impulses, seemed momentarily shaken. "But there's more," Philip continued, his voice barely steady. "She writes that she enjoyed watching the Duchess decline, knowing she was the architect of that suffering. The power, she said, was intoxicating after decades of powerlessness. She wasn't protecting me, Monsieur Poirot. She was using me as her justification, her excuse. The murders gave her what she'd craved for 40 years, complete dominance over the sister who had dominated her." Poirot rose and paced to the window, where November fog pressed against the glass like a living shroud. "And Miss Hartwell?" "Planned for weeks. Mother had been timing her movements through the gardens at night, practicing the route to avoid detection. Emily's death was as calculated as everything else. She simply knew too much." After Philip departed to deliver this evidence to the authorities, Poirot sat in profound silence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried deep weariness. "We thought we understood, Hastings. We saw a desperate mother protecting her son, tragic but comprehensible. Instead, we witnessed something far more sinister, a woman who spent decades nurturing hatred until it consumed every trace of humanity within her." "The depth of her deception is staggering," I murmured. "Even in death, she managed one final manipulation." "Non, mon ami. In death, she revealed her true nature at last. The maternal devotion was merely another mask, as carefully constructed as her alibi." He moved to the mantelpiece, adjusting a photograph with mechanical precision. "Lady Agnes was not created by desperation. She was forged by years of accumulated resentment, by the corruption of natural affection into something twisted beyond recognition." The afternoon post brought news from the remaining survivors of Witchford. Julia wrote from Oxford, where she was excelling in her legal studies. "The charitable foundations are being restructured. she reported, to ensure the money serves those in need without the cruelty that once accompanied it. Lord Adrian had sailed for Singapore, determined to build an honest life far from the ruins of his inheritance. And what of Witchford Abbey itself? I asked. The trustees have decided to close it indefinitely, Poirot replied, scanning another letter. Perhaps wisely. That house was a vessel for resentment, Hastings. It collected grudges as other houses collect dust. As evening settled over London, Poirot prepared his customary tisane with mathematical precision. The familiar ritual seemed to restore some measure of peace to his troubled thoughts. The case taught us something profound about the nature of charity and control, he reflected. The Duchess believed she could rule through financial dominance. That dependency would ensure loyalty. She forgot that when you strip a human being of dignity, you strip them of the constraints of conscience. In a very real sense, she spent 40 years constructing the weapon that would eventually destroy her. A grim philosophy, I observed, but a true one. Money is merely a tool. Used with love, it builds shelter. Used with arrogance, it builds a prison. The Witchford inheritance was poisoned long before the digitalis was ever harvested from the conservatory. Outside, the fog swirled against our windows, obscuring the world in grey uncertainty. But within our sanctuary, order prevailed. The case was finally, completely closed, though its lessons would echo in Poirot's memory for years to come. The execution of Lady Agnes Morven took place on a grey February morning, carried out with the efficient solemnity that English justice reserves for those who transgress its most sacred boundaries. Inspector Marsh delivered the news to our flat with characteristic directness, though I detected in his manner a reluctance to dwell on the details. She maintained perfect composure to the end, he reported, settling heavily into his chair. The chaplain said she expressed no remorse whatsoever. Her final words were chilling. I regret only that Beatrice did not suffer longer. Even facing eternity, she could not acknowledge the monster she had become. Poirot received this news with profound melancholy, spending the following days in unusual quietude. I found him one evening arranging his collection of Belgian stamps with obsessive precision, seeking solace in their geometric perfection against the chaotic memories of Witchford Abbey. "It troubles you still," I ventured, watching him straighten a commemorative stamp for the 10th time. "What disturbs me, Hastings, is not that she deceived us. Every criminal wears a mask. What haunts me is the sheer durability of her hatred. To sustain such a performance for 40 years, to play the grateful relation while cultivating poison in one's heart, this requires a discipline that is almost admirable, were it not so morally repugnant." He paused, his magnifying glass hovering motionless. "We fear the crime of passion, the sudden explosion of rage, but the crime of patience, that is the true horror. Lady Agnes did not kill because she lost control. She killed because she finally took it." The Duchess's final testament. 3 weeks after the execution, Sir Reginald arrived bearing unexpected closure. Among the Duchess's papers, filed with her London solicitors as a precaution, was a sealed letter addressed to Poirot with instructions for delivery only if she died under suspicious circumstances. The letter, penned in the Duchess's firm hand just days before her death, was both revelation and confession. "Monsieur Poirot, if you are reading this, my worst fears have proven accurate. I have discovered not merely theft, but a systematic campaign of cruelty directed against me by someone I once loved dearly. I confronted this person 3 days ago, hoping for remorse, but saw only cold calculation in eyes that once held warmth. I fear I have created a monster through my own pride and arrogance. If I die, know that I bear responsibility for nurturing the hatred that destroyed me. My greatest regret is not the fortune I accumulated, but the love I squandered by wielding charity as a weapon rather than offering it as a gift." Poirot folded the letter with infinite care. She understood at the end. She recognized her complicity in her own destruction. That required a different sort of courage than facing physical danger, but courage nonetheless. Redemption and renewal. Spring arrived with surprising gentleness, and with it came Julia Witchford, transformed by tragedy into someone of genuine substance. She had matured remarkably in the months since the Orme affair, her modern confidence now tempered with hard-won wisdom. "I've been thinking about Grandmother and Aunt Agnes," she said, accepting tea with graceful courtesy. Two brilliant women, both trapped by the conventions of their era. Grandmother wielded power through money because society denied her other avenues. Aunt Agnes nursed grievances because she had no legitimate outlet for her intelligence and ambition. In a different world, perhaps neither would have become what they did. "C'est possible, Mademoiselle Julia, but we cannot escape the choices we make within the world we inhabit. Your grandmother chose cruelty disguised as generosity. Your aunt chose murder disguised as justice. Both could have chosen differently." "I know, but I'm determined to break the pattern." Her eyes blazed with quiet determination. "The charitable foundations have been restructured to empower recipients rather than diminish them. Witchford Abbey itself will become a convalescent home for women recovering from hardship. Grandmother's money will shelter those who once would have stood shivering at its gates. And I'll practice law defending those without voices, rather than accumulating power for its own sake." The final accounting. After Julia's departure, Poirot stood at the window watching cherry blossoms drift through the afternoon light like pink snow. The estate had been settled with remarkable efficiency. Philip Morven received a modest bequest sufficient for a fresh start after serving his sentence, while the bulk of the fortune was restructured under independent trustees who understood that charity without compassion was merely another form of cruelty. "Perhaps some good emerges from even the darkest tragedies," Poirot mused. "That young woman has learned lessons her elders paid for with their lives and souls." The Witchford files were archived in our cabinet that evening, joining the countless mysteries Poirot had unraveled through application of his little grey cells. But this case held unique significance, not for its complexity or cleverness, but for its stark illumination of how pride and resentment, nurtured over decades, could transform decent people into monsters. "Money has a memory, Hastings," Poirot reflected, adjusting a vase with his characteristic precision. "It remembers how it was made and how it was kept. The Witchford fortune was preserved in vinegar, not honey. It will take a generation to wash away the taste." Philosophical closure. As evening shadows lengthened across our sitting room, I asked for his final assessment of the case. Poirot's moustaches twitched thoughtfully. The greatest mysteries are not those of locked rooms and missing weapons, but of the human heart. Lady Agnes murdered two innocent women not from necessity, but from the corrupting influence of accumulated bitterness. The Duchess created her own nemesis through decades of casual cruelty disguised as benevolence. Both were victims of their own choices. He moved to his desk, where the case file lay neatly tied with ribbon, ready for the archives. The Duchess, who left no will in the legal sense, this was untrue. But in the spiritual sense, she left no goodwill, no legacy of love. She left only a vacuum where affection should have been, and nature abhors a vacuum. Lady Agnes simply filled that empty space with malice. The return to order. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed the hour, and Poirot consulted his pocket watch with critical attention. "Precision, Hastings. It is the only defense against chaos. Lady Agnes was precise in her hatred, so we were precise in our justice. The equation is balanced, the book is closed." He moved toward the dining room, pausing to smooth his magnificent moustaches in the hallway mirror. "The dead are at rest, the wicked are punished, and Mrs. Pearson assures me the Blanquette de Veau has been reducing since noon. In a world of moral chaos, let us at least appreciate the perfection of a well-cooked meal." Outside, the cherry blossoms continued their gentle descent, covering London's grey streets in transient beauty. Life persisted in its eternal rhythm, indifferent to human tragedy, carrying forward those who survived to face whatever mysteries tomorrow might bring. The affair at Witchford Abbey had concluded, but its lessons would echo through Poirot's memory, a reminder that the most dangerous poisons are not those extracted from foxgloves, but those cultivated in the human heart through decades of wounded pride and systematic cruelty. And so Hercule Poirot, with characteristic composure, turned from the window toward his dinner, leaving behind another solved mystery and carrying forward the eternal hope that, understanding human darkness, might somehow illuminate the path toward human light.